So I travelled 200 miles to see Dune at the Manchester Printworks VU. It's funny, I'm smiling because I just see a notification on the phone I'm filming this on from my friend, who I just told that I did that, and he said, "You know that you're absolutely fucking insane," because it's kind of true, but there's a reason why I did it, and it's because every IMAX in London, or I should say any IMAX in London, there is no IMAX in London that is showing the film in its actual photographed aspect ratio, which sounds wrong, and it is wrong, particularly because there are screens in London which should show the film in that format. There are screens that are that size, but due to technological limitations, or technical restrictions rather, they don't. And that's weird. And I'm going to break down why in a video, because I'm the only person who cares, and it's important that more people care than just me. So, where to begin? Well, there are three formats that Dune is showing in theaters right now. The first being the standard 2:3:5 to 1, and you can imagine that I'm doing the SpongeBob like dotted lines appearing around my hands as I do this. 2:3:5 to 1 aspect ratio, which every non-IMAX theater is showing the film in. And then you have all the IMAX theaters, which will be showing, most of which will be showing the film with a slightly taller aspect ratio, which is about 1:6:5 to 1, something like that. It'll accommodate like 26% more picture at the top and bottom of the screen. And that's pretty big, and that's what most IMAX enhanced films are shot in. Like all the Marvel movies are shot like that, and Mission Impossible is shot like that, and even Blade Runner 2049 was shot in that format. And so you just need that size can be accommodated by pretty much every IMAX that's out there. But every now and then there is I haven't taken a breath in like 2 minutes. But every now and then there is a film that takes full advantage of the maximum possible size that IMAX can be, which is 1:4:3 to 1. And those are mostly the Christopher Nolan films. So that's what every IMAX sequence in the Dark Knight trilogy is shot in. I don't believe any Inception is shot like that though. And I've seen Inception in the BFI IMAX, and it never filled the whole thing. And Interstellar does, and so does Dunkirk, and so does Tenet. And I'm fortunate enough to live just 20 minutes away from the only IMAX in Europe that can show or project 15 by 70 millimeter IMAX film, which is what Christopher Nolan shoots those films on. And so I see his films multiple times in theaters, and they also play at least once a year on repeat on those theaters, because in that one theater, because it's the only theater that has the film reel, because it's the only theater in Europe that can show it in that format. So Christopher Nolan's films have historically been the only films of recent memory that are shot in that aspect ratio until Dune. And Dune has kind of exposed some London cinemas for not having all the requisite technology set up to project every film the way that, or any film that is shot in that aspect ratio in full IMAX, the way that the director shot it, because Dune is not shot on IMAX 1570mm film to get that aspect ratio. It's shot on digital, and the only theaters that can project Dune in that aspect ratio are IMAX with laser projectors. So the BFI IMAX, despite with Christopher Nolan films that are projected on film having that size screen, 1:4:3 to 1 aspect ratio, to be able to project a film in its full IMAX aspect ratio, and it's the flagship IMAX in the city and the country and the United Kingdom, cannot show Dune, which is a digitally shot film, in that aspect ratio, because their digital projector which is an IMAX, I believe it's called a Xenon projector, is not an IMAX with laser projector, is not that great. And so I guess they just refused to play it in that format. Maybe IMAX have their standards where they don't show it, they just don't give them the print. But they're happy for it to project in IMAX format with 26% more picture. I don't know why. There is one IMAX with laser auditorium in the UK, in London rather, that has that aspect ratio and has that projector, and it is the newly named Ronson Theatre at the London Science Museum, which was refurbished and reopened last December 2020. However, even though they've said they're going to be playing Hollywood films, are only showing like IMAX science nature documentaries, which I'm surprised Dune doesn't qualify for, but it doesn't. And they just didn't get the distribution to show either Dune or No Time to Die, which was also had sequences in that aspect ratio in IMAX with laser 1:3:1 aspect ratio. And that means that the only theatre in the UK which is showing Dune in its intended aspect ratio and also showed No Time to Die in its originally shot aspect ratio, some of the sequences at least, is the View, I believe it's pronounced, Manchester Printworks IMAX, which is in Manchester. And so that's why I had to go down there in order to see the film in that format, because it's not just a difference of 26%, which is already pretty substantial. Like, you ideally, when you see a film, want to see everything the director shot, because shot composition exists for a reason. You wouldn't take like a painting and cut the tops and bottoms off 26% and say like, that's the same painting, or you haven't lost anything. You've cut out a quarter of the image. And so with this being an even taller aspect ratio, you're not just cutting out 26%, you're cutting out 40% of the picture. So despite the fact that I had seen Dune twice, I had only seen 60% of the picture. There was a full 40% of the image at the top and bottom, which I had not seen, and odds are you also have not seen, unless you're fortunate enough to live in an area where you have an IMAX with laser projector and an auditorium which is in that aspect ratio. So I've kind of seen the film all three ways now. I'd seen them in, well, not all three, but I've seen it in three different ways. The first way was a completely standard presentation in 2:3:5:1 with no fancy IMAXing or Dolbying at all, and it was still a very nice presentation. It was in the BFI South Bank, which is a lovely auditorium, and I had seen it there about at the start of the month, I think the 5th of October it was, and then I'd seen it on the 22nd when the film released wide at the Odeon Leicester Square, which is a Dolby theatre, where it was still projected in 2:3:5:1, but it had Dolby Vision as the projector and Dolby Atmos surround sound. And that auditorium has the best audio of any theatre I've ever been at, and I go to pretty much all of them, and it definitely has the most impactful sound. Like, Dune just sounded unbelievable. The way the aircrafts in particular sounded, it felt like I was in a plane, like my stomach was doing that thing that it does in planes where you can kind of feel everything you've just eaten and drank and it hollows out. I could have seen it at the Cineworld Leicester Square across the street, but again, though that theatre has an IMAX with laser projector, the aspect ratio is not 1:3:1. It would only have given me 26% more image, and so I thought to myself, I would rather experience the best 2:3:5:1 version of the film that I can, which would be at a Dolby cinema, rather than seeing it in an IMAX with slightly more, but wishing all the time that I'd gotten slightly more. I mean, I could see it in that format now and kind of compare and contrast. It's the only format that I haven't seen the film in. But what really pushed me to go to Manchester was the fact that I checked what aspect ratio the studio had released the film on on digital on HBO Max, and I was hopeful because they released like the Snyder Cut in 4:3 that they might release it in its intended aspect ratio and just have the film go from, black bars at the top to black bars on the side. So I was hoping they would retain the intended original aspect ratio so that people who didn't get a chance to see the film in that aspect ratio in theaters would at least get to see the whole image in at home release. But that's not what they did. The aspect ratio for Dune on HBO Max and other platforms is just 2:3:5 and so I assume that's what it's going to be on the Blu-ray as well. And so I thought that I might never get a chance to see Dune, all of Dune, 40% more of Dune. I'll only have seen 60% of Dune if I don't go to Manchester and don't see the film in its full aspect ratio, because 60% is almost half of the entire image of the film. And that's what you're probably wondering, that, okay, you've traveled 200 miles, you went on a 6-hour round trip to see this film in this ratio. How big of a difference does it make? Did it justify your trip? And it absolutely did. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my entire life. Not that you haven't seen the film. If you have only seen it in 2:3:5 or in the 26% more IMAX ratio, it's not like with David Lynch saying if you've seen a film on your telephone then you haven't seen a film. But there's really no comparison between the two formats. The sense of scope and scale that the full presentation in 1:4:3 gives, it's as dramatic as a Christopher Nolan film, but in some ways more so. The kind of artistry and the art style of Dune with its desert landscape brings as much to Dune as certainly space did to Interstellar. I mean, I've seen Dunkirk and Tenet on 70mm film, and I've seen it in that aspect ratio, and they look fantastic, and I love them. But in terms of drama that they add to the story, or a kind of emotional experience, it doesn't add a tremendous amount. Like, you could watch Tenet or Dunkirk in a standard theatre, maybe less so with Dunkirk, and get not a life and death or night and day is a less dramatic comparison difference of experience. But with Interstellar, for example, and with Dune, they're just different films at that size, and Dune even more so than Interstellar. I feel that there are more sequences in full IMAX and more shots that take advantage of that aspect ratio in Dune than in Interstellar, and it's just jaw-dropping the entire time because the desert landscape is so huge, and so much of the film's intent is to show really huge landscapes and then characters and aircrafts and vehicles looking really, really tiny, and you just don't get as much of that impact. In fact, there were entire shots that I'd seen yesterday that I'd apparently seen twice, but that I never really looked twice at or remembered until I saw them yesterday. There were so many that I'm like, is this like an extended thing? Have I seen this before? Because I don't remember. Because that's how big of a difference that the 40% increased picture gave it. And while I tried not to let it bother me too much watching the film in 2:3:5 that I was missing out on anything, the one thing that I felt was kind of wrong was the size of the sandworms. The Shai Hulud were just too small. I thought that the sandworm was too small. And that scene, you've seen in all the trailers where the sandworm is chasing up on Timothy Chalamet and Rebecca Ferguson, and then it opens all wide and they're standing there and it's all big. I just found that it was a little bit too small in the 2:3:5 I didn't really feel that, oh my god, it's this giant sandworm that is clearly meant to give to you. It's kind of like the airplane scene in Tenet where it's crashing into the Freeport. And unless you're seeing that in an IMAX, you're not getting an idea of how big that motherfucker is. The sandworm in 135 to 1 is absolutely, or 143 to 1 rather, is absolutely gigantic. It feels like when he was composing the shot, when he was setting everything up, and he was getting a sense of scale, when he was drawing the storyboard, that was the size that it was supposed to look like. It was not supposed to be smaller than that. It was not supposed to have the tops and bottoms cut out. It was meant to take up an entire screen in 143 to 1. And it was awesome how huge it was. And there were so many other shots like that with vehicles, because so many of the aircrafts in the film are so tall. They're so huge that the shots that are cropped in that aspect ratio or shot in that 143 to 1 aspect ratio, because the whole film isn't. I think it's probably something like 50-50. Maybe a little bit less, but every sequence that you'd think would need to be shot in 143 to 1, all the aircraft sequences, all the dream sequences, all the sandworm sequences, all the action sequences are all shot in that format. Most of the dialogue sequences are not shot in that format, and most of them don't need to be. The one thing that I wish was shot in that aspect ratio that wasn't would be any shot with Stellan Skarsgård, because Stellan Skarsgård as Baron Harkonnen is so perfect, and his character model, it reminded me of Kingpin in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, where he's just this big boy. He's just huge. He's just fat and gross and just like monstrous. And there's even that shot of him from the trailer where he's like floating in the air and he's like, "It's my tune," and you want him to take up the entire thing, and he never does. And I thought that was a missed opportunity. Hopefully in the Dune Part 2 we get a shot of Stellan Skarsgård taking up an entire IMAX screen, but we don't get it in this film. In Part 1, there's even the sequence on Gidi Prime where it's first on Gidi Prime and you get the text it's Gidi Prime. You get the establishing shot in full IMAX. You get Batista going down the stairs in full IMAX. You get him walking up to Stellan Skarsgård in full IMAX, and the second it cuts to him, it crops, and you're like, oh. So I hope we get a full big boy IMAX scene of Stellan Skarsgård, just kind of floating around in full IMAX in Dune Part 2. So much of the emotion and the intent in the filmmaking is to make the characters feel small and make the environment seem all dominating and all, enveloping, that, everyone who's got their big plays going on is just like an insignificant speck of dust in the big scheme of things and in the world and in nature. And that comes across in this presentation in 143 to 1 that just doesn't in the standard 235 to 1 aspect ratio. I mean, the shots still look very pretty in that aspect ratio. It still looks nice, but you don't get nearly that impact of the size of the worlds and the size of the numbers. It's not just the scale of the environment, but in many sequences in the movie, a lot of the impact's meant to come from the numbers of armies that are at play. So there's a shot on Gidi Prime, or maybe it was with the Sardaukar forces, where they're all in a row kind of from top to bottom of the screen, and there's just so many of them, and it looks just absolutely dominating in a way that it didn't in the standard aspect ratio. And there's moments with vehicles like the scene where, spoilers I guess, even though it's in the trailer, the scene where the Sardaukar are attacking and the Harkonnens are attacking the Atreides on Arrakis. The impact of seeing ships firing missiles all the way at the top of the screen at little forces that are at the bottom of the screen is just so much more impactful, and just it was completely transformative how that looked in IMAX compared to how it looked in a standard aspect ratio, that it almost becomes a different scene. In terms of my review of the film in general, I've seen it 3 times now, and I travelled halfway across the country in order to see it a third time in its proper aspect ratio, which I didn't do for, as I said, No Time to Die, so I clearly liked it quite a bit. It is my favourite film of the year. In fact, it's my favourite film, I think, of the last 2 years. I can't even think of anything else that came out in 2020 that I liked as much as Dune. I really love so much of what's going on in this film. It's got stuff in it that is masterpiece level, 10 out of 10 level. Everything, when all the elements of the film are working perfectly, when you have Denis Villeneuve's direction in combination with Hans Zimmer's score, which is just like astonishing sounding in certain points where the dream sequences have this really magical quality to them, that when that's going, and then you have, it's Greg Fraser doing the cinematography, not Roger Deakins, who did Sicario and Blade Runner and Prisoners. It just looks absolutely gorgeous. When all those three things are working together, that's like 10 out of 10 stuff. This is like, I've never experienced this kind of moment in a film before, or not exactly like this before, and will not again. Denis Villeneuve, one of the things I love the most about his direction and his movies is the way he's able to seamlessly blend the CGI that he has, and sometimes there is quite a bit of CGI in his films, and the practical sets and the real locations that he uses, and makes it almost indistinguishable as to what's CGI and what's not, to the point where you are never, ever thinking about the CGI in his films. You're never looking at the sandworm and going, that's CGI. Even though you know it's CGI, if you thought about it, it's obviously CGI. There's no giant sandworm in real life. You can't build a giant sandworm prop, that's 400 feet and do that. But the way with lighting, and I guess just how much you can detail the technology, but I guess anybody can do that, and most don't. It was similar in Blade Runner and even Arrival. The way that he integrates computer generated effects in their lighting and their textures into, that aren't just like metal. They're not just like the Iron Man suit, but they're like beings that have like flesh and things that would typically stick out as being CGI, because the film is amazing. Like, I had been reading the book in preparation for the film coming out. I know people said that this film cuts off at a kind of abrupt point, but I also stopped reading the book at a very abrupt point, and so it kind of mirrored my experience. But it's extremely faithful to the book, and I think Denis Villeneuve's style of filmmaking suits Dune even more than it did 2049, if that makes sense. At least when I came away from 2049 the first time, I felt a kind of coldness. I felt a kind of coldness to the plot. It took me like a second viewing to really get emotionally attached and invested to the characters. I mean, I knew watching it the first time what the events that happened at the end meant to the characters. I knew what it meant to the plot, but I didn't feel them myself, because the whole film kind of, as I say, the kind of scope and scale of it makes everybody feel like ants, and you're not really getting inside the characters' heads. And the same thing happened with me for Arrival. It took me a second viewing of Arrival to really feel closer to Amy Adams' character, and it took a second viewing of 2049 to really feel closer to Ryan Gosling's character. But I think maybe it's Timothée Chalamet's performance, but I didn't feel that way about Dune. Maybe because I'd read the book beforehand as well, so I'd already gotten a bit more insight and feeling into the characters. But the book is kind of similarly not very big on emotion as much as it is thoughts and ideas and the mind. And so Denis Villeneuve actually, I think, matches the book and the feeling the book has quite perfectly. Other like little moments in the movie that I love are any points where Paul Atreides is watching like educational videos on his little projector about the world. There's so much in the movie that is so like kind of peaceful, and again, it feels kind of dreamlike. The way that the audio sounds kind of like echoey, and the music is like very soft. There's one point where the ship that, again, spoilers, that Timothy and Rebecca are going into this sandstorm, and the ship is like flying around, and it's so much noise and it's so loud, and then it just hard cuts to a scene in the Baron Harkonnen's like medical room, whatever, and the music is just super super like quiet and soft and nice sounding, and it's like him healing in like a mud bath. And just there's like one or two moments like that just have hard cuts from like really really big loud things to really really quiet soft things. If I had to ding the film in some way, I can't really fault it. I can't really say there's any element in this film that's of low quality. I'd say that maybe, if anything, it might be too short still in comparison to the book. For example, is like Dr. Yue, where you kind of see more of that character before the thing that happens with that character that inform him more, and not after the fact. And it seems it's something of a pattern with Denis Villeneuve films that he will kind of front load the emotion or tail load it, where a lot of the emotional meat of a character, a lot of their motivation, a lot of their everything will kind of be revealed to you in one scene at a pivotal point, and you're meant to like retroactively care and feel about the character that you've seen up to this point because of that moment, at that pivotal point. But it's kind of hard to retroactively care or feel, at least for me, when you just kind of stick it in there at the end. It feels like his films are less concerned with character development and character moments as they are with like the filmmaking, presentational, cinematic moments, which is fine. I think it, like I say, I think it works for Dune more than any other film he's ever made, and it's great. But it means that I think the film clearly has a lot of moments where you're like, that's the point, that's the film, that's the everything, and other moments where you're like, that are perfectly good, you're watching them, they're written well, they're performed well, but they're not like mesmerizing you in the same way that other sequences are. And for me, like films that are like, because the fact that I'm even thinking of the word like masterpiece, thinking of this movie, means that it's really really good. Like it's so close, like it's so very nearly close. But I think those movies have as memorable of dialogue and as memorable character interactions as their bigger, more cinematic scenes. And I think that while Denis has scenes like that in his films, like I guess an example in 2049 would be with Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford in the casino, kind of like fighting. That's one of them. I think that Timothy Chalamet in this film and Rebecca Ferguson in The Tent, when after they have landed, it's the night of like the Atreides household or the Atreides palace being attacked on Arrakis. The interactions that they have, that night in the tent really like hit that. But I don't think that the other sequences in the film do quite as much. But that's the only thing that would stop me giving Dune like a 10. Right now, if I had to rate the film, I have it rated on IMDb as an 8. I've never wanted to give something a 9 so much. I think I could give the film a 9 and sleep at night, but I think it'll come down to part two coming out, because this is only half the story. It's by no means the full story. It's been cut, just sliced in half, and there's just no third act as yet. And I think when part two comes out, I'll, if it is as amazing as part one is, then that'll get a 9, and I'll give part one a 9, and then Dune, the film, will be a 9 out of 10. And I believe that's what I gave Blade Runner 2049 as well. It could be a 10. I mean, I'm gonna watch the film more. I'm gonna watch the film more times than I already have, but right now I have it as an 8. But there are like sequences and moments in the film that are a 10, that are like some of the most magical, insane, amazing things I've seen in a film. And for that, it's, that's why I saw the film 3 times. It's why I traveled 200 miles to see it in a different city, and why I would do it again if I had to for part two, because Denis Villeneuve is, I think he's probably at this point my favorite filmmaker working today. I mean, it's pretty close. I mean, we had before him it was Alejandro Gonzalez Iñárritu, but it's been 4 years since his last film, or no, it's been 5 years, 6 since The Revenant, and he just hasn't done anything since then. He did his VR, little mini movie cinematic experience thing where I believe you were like an illegal immigrant going across the US border. I mean, I would go legally across the US border to see his next film, but doesn't exist. We have no idea what it is. He hasn't said anything. I don't think anyone's heard from him. He just made 2 absolute 10 out of 10 bangers in a row and then just bounced. And then you have I guess Robert Eggers, who did The Witch, and he did The Lighthouse, and his next film, The Northman, is coming out next April, and I gave The Lighthouse a 10. I don't think I've ever given a Denis Villeneuve, I haven't given any Denis Villeneuve film a 10, but I gave The Lighthouse a 10, and I'm excited for The Northman. But Denis Villeneuve is one of the best filmmakers working today. I love every single film of his, every single one. But that's my review of the state of IMAX theatres in the UK, and my review of Dune. And I might make more of these. It was pretty easy. Fortunately, I mean, if you're watching this, it means I thought it was good enough to upload, which would be quite a thing for me. And I will just have this probably on private or like shared only. I might share this in some forums or something again if you're watching this, then I have. But I'll make more when I see more films, which is all the time. And so thank you for watching. If you've watched this, I'm sure it's going to be a pretty long video. If you've watched up to this point, thank you. And I'll see you in the next one.